Welcome to Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharon Jitlale in Singapore. The headlines. The scramble for aid in Indonesia after the earthquake as rescuers make a final effort to find survivors before ending the search operation.
Here in the city of Palu, electricity is back up and the economy is starting to move again.
And US senators have the FBI report on Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, who's been accused of sexual misconduct. Key Democrats say it's incomplete.
We had many fears that this was a very limited process that would constrain the FBI from getting all the facts. Having received a thorough briefing on the documents, those fears have been realized.
I'm Kasia Madeira in London. Also in this programme, Western nations attack what they claim are Russian spies hacking into governments and institutions around the world. And we travel to Vietnam to find out why it's so vulnerable to climate change and rising sea levels.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Now it's 11 in the evening in London, 6 a.m. here in Singapore and also in Palu, Indonesia, where the death toll from last week's 7.5 magnitude earthquake and tsunami currently stands at 1,424. The fear is that figure will rise further as most of the dead accounted for have been from the main city of Palu, while figures for some remote areas remain partially or totally unknown. While more international aid is arriving, but reports say it is likely to reach only a fraction of the people who need it, with some areas of the island still cut off. Well, for the latest, let's go now to Mariko Oy, who's in Palu with all the latest. Mariko.
Well, Sharon, today marks 1 week from that deadly earthquake and tsunami, which killed, as you mentioned, at least 1,400 people. But here in the city of Palu, we actually got electricity back up last night after President Widodo said that it could take weeks to get it restored. And in terms of food and water, we've been talking about how survivors were struggling to get hold of them all week. But we are starting to see quite a lot of them on the street, people starting to selling it on the street as well. At the same time, the last push to find those survivors is continuing, and also the recovery of bodies. For example, here at the Ramayana Plaza, where we've been broadcasting all week from, we finally got this big crane yesterday afternoon, and they started to clear the area. One body at least, when we were here, was discovered, and there were police officers and military personnel looking for more bodies yesterday. There are fears that more could be found, and that's because the earthquake, of course, hit at 5 p.m. local time on Friday, where many people could have been inside shopping there. And that's why the authority says that the death toll could rise even further. Our correspondent Jonathan Head has been reporting from the city of Palu.
A government office in Palu, and tempers are fraying. This woman wants to know why no help has come to her neighbourhood yet. I'm also a victim, a volunteer shouts back, but at least we're doing what we can. 6 days into this overwhelming disaster, they're now trying to count the missing. Names and photos left taped on the walls. Among them, Zalzabila Olia Zabrianti, a university student in Palu. Her family has travelled 300 miles from her hometown to try to find her. They've made photocopies of her description. Zalzabila was right in its path when the tsunami struck, yet they believe she may be alive. We think so, says her uncle Imaduddin. We've already seen so many bodies and opened so many body bags, and she wasn't among them. They decide to go back to where she was last Friday, passing apocalyptic scenes that must have been disheartening for them. They stuck her photo onto whatever posts were still standing after the tsunami. And her father, Sadran, showed it to the police. She was wearing a yellow shirt and black trousers, he explains. It rings a bell with one of the officers. I'm going to the hospital to see a body they have there, he told me. She also has black trousers, he's been told, although the shirt has been torn off. But as they're about to leave, someone shouts that they've found a body in the collapsed recreation centre where Zalzabila had been last Friday. This is an all too familiar scene in Palu now. But for Sadran, not knowing whether they might have found his daughter, it's a harrowing wait. As they bring out the body, though, he hears it was a pregnant woman. It's not Zalzabila. The commanding officer commiserates with Sadran. His search must go on. Today, this has become one of the most characteristic and mournful sights in Palu. Excavators pulling away at the rubble, trying to get at the bodies of victims. There's much more of this heavy machinery now than a few days ago, and yet given the sheer size of this disaster, it's likely that many of the victims will never be found. These searchers think they've found another body, but they're not sure yet how to reach it. One more victim to add to a growing total. Jonathan Head, BBC News, Palu, Indonesia.
Well, Bhavita Dewi from World Vision joins us live. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Firstly, if you can tell us when you managed to get into Palu and what kind of work you've been doing.
So I have arrived here on the October 1st, and so far that we on the team already do some of the psychosocial support to the children, to our child-friendly spaces, and we managed also to distribute a shelter kit to the affected people.
We found ourselves, it was quite tricky to get to Palu. What's been the biggest challenge so far?
Yeah, the biggest challenge so far is also, of course, about the transportation, how to reach the area. We also have difficulty about the shortage of fuel, and also we have difficulty to actually coordinate with the other organization about the finding the need of the affected people.
Here in the city of Palu, it feels like things are starting to improve, but of course there are smaller villages that haven't actually got any supplies as well, and President Widodo has been criticized for not actually doing enough for them. Have you managed to reach those villages?
Yes, of course. We actually already here in about like 2010, and our area is also in that small village. So yeah, that's it.
And what have those villagers been telling you? Are they critical of the government?
Yeah, they're questioning why the aid is actually late to arrive the area. But there's actually now the government already managed to establish the public kitchen as part of their approach to the community.
And what kind of need, when you visited them, what do they need exactly right now?
So food and water is basically their priority of need, and shelter and some of the medical treatment.
Of course, there are also children as well. Are there any special needs that people need?
Yeah, I think because of the children also affected because of tsunami and an earthquake, they're kind of stressed with this situation. School buildings are collapsed. They have no place to actually having an education activity, and also they have no place to play. So they have to live in a small tent with all the family and the other families. So that's the need that at the moment we try here actually giving the psycho support to the children.
Bhavita Dewi, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and good luck. And as we've been reporting, things are starting to improve slowly but surely here in the city of Palu. And we've really been struck by the generosity of people all week. Even though they have very limited food and water, as soon as they started to get hold of them, they started offering it to us. So the resilience of people has been very noted. Back to you, Kasia.
Mariko, many thanks to you and your guest, and it's good to hear that resilient spirit is strong in Palu. Of course, we've got much more on our website, and that recovery operation, of course, underway right now. Let's bring you up to date with some of the day's other news. There are mixed views coming out of Washington on the report into the allegations of sexual misconduct against President Trump's Supreme Court nominee. The Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, speaking here in the Senate, said that the latest FBI background check found no evidence to prove any of the allegations levelled against Judge Brett Kavanaugh. That contrasted significantly to the views of Democrat Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who said he wanted the redacted documents published and feared that little had been achieved by the investigation.
We had many fears that this was a very limited process that would constrain the FBI from getting all the facts. Having received a thorough briefing on the documents, those fears have been realized. Second, I disagree. Having received a briefing on all of the documents, I disagree with Senator Grassley's statement that there was no hint of misconduct.
Now, in other news, an investigation has begun in Malaysia into how a team of 6 rescue divers drowned while they were trying to find a teenager who fell into a pool at a disused mine. They were searching for the 17-year-old on Wednesday when they were caught in a whirlpool. Officials said that the divers were all attached to a single rope and were unable to pull themselves out of the vortex. The search for the missing boy was called off after this tragedy. The US Vice President Mike Pence has accused China of trying to undermine President Trump as the administration deploys tough new rhetoric over Chinese trade, economic and foreign policies. Mr. Pence said that China is using its power to interfere in US domestic politics.
China has initiated an unprecedented effort to influence American public opinion, the 2018 elections, and the environment leading into the 2020 presidential elections. To put it bluntly, President Trump's leadership is working, and China wants a different American president.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin is visiting India for talks with the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, during which he'll confirm a $5 billion deal for anti-aircraft missiles. Russia remains India's top military supplier, despite the fact that the United States has warned any deal would attract sanctions. Mr. Putin and Mr. Modi are also expected to discuss the possible Russian construction of another nuclear plant and Russian training for Indian astronauts. Bahrain is getting a $10 billion aid package from its neighbours Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and the UAE. The Bahraini economy has been hit hard by lower oil prices in recent years, and there are fears of a potential financial crisis spreading across the region. The aid is expected to be delivered over 5 years. More than 500 million Chinese people have been enjoying the week-long national holiday, which started on Monday. Many have been taking advantage of this period to spend time with family and friends and enjoying this beautiful autumnal scenery, looking gorgeous. Figures released show that a total of 502 million domestic tourists took part in activities over the first 4 days of the holiday period. It also actually accounted for the country's tourism industry, taking in more than $60 billion.
Now, Britain, the Netherlands and the United States have set out detailed allegations against Russia, accusing it of carrying out a widespread campaign of cyber attacks against Western targets. Russia has denied it all, dismissing it as a Western spy mania. Well, our security correspondent Gordon Carrera reports from The Hague.
Caught in the act, the moment 4 Russian spies were detained in the Netherlands. Their plan: to use the equipment in the boot of their car to hack into computer networks. The story was made public today in an extraordinary joint British and Dutch news conference, in which the details were laid bare and the finger pointed at the GRU, Russian military intelligence.
It can no longer be allowed to act aggressively across the world against vital international organizations with apparent impunity.
This is where the Russians were caught, in this hotel car park in The Hague in April of this year. The reason they were here is because just next door is the headquarters of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. At the time, the OPCW was investigating the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury, as well as a chemical attack in Syria. The Salisbury attack would eventually lead to the death of Dawn Sturgis and has been blamed on Russia. The 4 Russians arrived on April 10th. They were using diplomatic passports and carrying €20,000 and $20,000. They were secretly photographed carrying out reconnaissance of the OPCW the next day. In the boot of their car, they had what's called close access equipment. This would allow them to intercept passwords as OPCW staff logged into their computers so that the Russians could break into the systems. But the Dutch, with help from the British, had been watching and waiting.
We were watching that closely at that moment, and as soon as we had the idea that the equipment was getting working, we disrupted the operation.
And you're confident that this is Russian military intelligence, the GRU?
We are 100% confident that this is the GRU, Russian intelligence, yes.
So what ties them to the GRU? Their phones were activated close to a GRU base. One even carried a taxi receipt from outside a GRU base in Moscow to the airport from the day they left. And information on the laptop of one of the men, pictured here, links his computer directly to a series of cyber attacks, including into the investigation of the downed Malaysian MH17 flight and the hacking of athletes' data from the World Anti-Doping Agency. Today, the British government also detailed other cyber attacks linked to the GRU, which hit businesses across Europe, even a small TV station in the UK.
The way that we are going to prevent an escalation is by making sure when this kind of thing happens that Russia knows that it's a red line, that there are consequences, that the price is going to be too high.
And in the final coordinated move, this afternoon the US Department of Justice issued its own detailed indictments against 7 GRU officers for a range of cyber attacks, focusing particularly on sporting bodies.
And that was Gordon Herrera there reporting from The Hague. While you're watching Newsday on the BBC, still to come on the programme, a journey to Vietnam to find out why it's one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change and rising sea levels.
Take away the noise,
the fury,
the fighting voices,
the distortions,
cosmetics, the color and the flashy effects. But most of all,
you can take away the lies,
the slander,
the misrepresentation
that seeks to pull us apart. And
then you can find out
what's actually happening.
And when you find that,
then you'll find
BBC News.
In Front Row, we're asking if we're seeing a new vision of old age and if the media are finally waking up to the power of the older audience. Do some artists do their best work after 70? So roll over, you millennials, and join me, Mary Beard, on BBC World News.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharanjit Lail in Singapore.
And I'm Kasia Madeira in London. Our top story this hour. People are still scrambling for aid in Indonesia after the earthquake and tsunami as rescuers make a final effort to find survivors before ending the search operation.
And US senators have the FBI report on Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, who's been accused of sexual misconduct. Key Democrats say it's incomplete, but many Republicans are satisfied.
Now let's take a look at some of the front pages from the international newspapers, and we're going to start with the South China Morning Post because the paper reports on the impact the US-China trade war will have on the Hong Kong economy. Almost half of Chinese goods are shipped via Hong Kong to the United States, and factory owners are rushing to deliver goods before tariffs rise in January. Next to the Straits Times, which leads with the corruption charges against Malaysia's former First Lady, Rosmah Mansor, who is married to the Former Prime Minister Najib Razak has pleaded not guilty to 17 counts of money laundering and tax evasion of more than $2.3 million. And finally, to the Japan Times, which has a story about two Japanese giants joining forces. Toyota and SoftBank are working together to develop self-driving technology and on-demand services like food deliveries, medical care and office space. So you're up to date with all the papers. Now, Sharonjit, what stories are sparking discussions online?
Well, Kash, it's a rather odd story, but it's been attracting a lot of attention online and off. It's a story about Egypt Air. They've been forced to defend an interview with actress Drew Barrymore, which was published in its in-flight magazine, after it was slammed on social media. The article was riddled with grammatical errors and unlikely quotes from the actress, whose representatives say she didn't actually participate in that interview. Now, rising sea levels, punishing droughts and life-threatening heat waves. Well, these are the potential impacts of global warming, and many of the world's most vulnerable countries say that the world must do more to limit the average rise in global temperatures. Well, one of those is Vietnam, and from there our science editor David Shookman reports.
The painful sight of homes lost to the waves. The land here in the Mekong Delta is sinking, and at the same time the sea is rising as the world gets warmer. It's not just houses being destroyed. Farmland is vanishing as well. These farmers saw their fields slip underwater, and they're worried that it'll never be possible to hold back the sea. Climate change is getting worse, says Lam Van Nia, and the water level is rising so fast we don't have time to build defences. The threat is felt throughout the Mekong Delta. In the city of Can Tho, we found this flood barrier half finished. The homes behind it keep getting flooded. There are 18 million people living in this region, and they're only just above the level of the sea. So even a small rise could be devastating, which is why Vietnam and dozens of other countries facing the same threat want to see global warming limited as much as possible. Over the centuries, floods have been positive, bringing natural fertilizer to the paddy fields, helping to make this region one of the world's great rice producers. But the rising ocean means seawater is now pushing inland, and the salt is poisoning the soil. A local scientist, Professor Zong Van Ni, has developed a simple test for farmers to check if the water is too salty.
How much salt water here is flooding.
So that's very salty?
It's very salty.
That's about like seawater?
About seawater, yeah.
So you can't grow any rice in that?
Yeah, we cannot grow rice, yeah.
Many parts of the delta have already given up with rice. This farmer has switched to hay, which is more tolerant of salt. The days of rice, a vital source of food, may actually be over, according to the UN's head of agriculture here.
This is all under threat. The rice production is under threat. 80% of the rice that comes from this region goes into export, so it's a big economic risk for Vietnam.
So what does this mean for the future? 3 years ago, this primary school was swamped by the river beside it. The rising waters are becoming more dangerous. A researcher, Florence Halstead, is here to find out what the children think.
I'm really interested in is what it's like in the flood season. So, could you all close your eyes, and I want you to really think about being in the flood season.
Loy, aged 10, has something shocking on his mind.
The people scream out to help.
Scream out to help.
To help them.
Right.
Florence then asks the children to draw pictures of flooding, and they conjure up nightmare images of houses being washed away and hands reaching above the water. 10-year-old Tor New sketches a girl in a boat shouting for help.
I think the flood is so scary, and I hope we will not be swept away.
Chow has pictured a giant snake. I ask her why.
Because the snake can live underwater and is very dangerous, so it makes me think about the flood.
The hope is that encouraging this openness about flooding will prepare the children for the more hostile climate they're likely to face as adults.
They live in a water world, and that's only going to increase. The water's not going away. They need to learn how to adapt, and whether that be through education like this, through community groups, that resilience really needs to be built up.
Back at the coast, work on new sea defences. Scientists used to think there was a safe limit for global warming of 2 degrees. But they now say we need a lower target to avoid serious damage to countries like this. And we're about to get a major report on how to do that. David Shukman, BBC News in Vietnam.
And it's children making the most pertinent points there as usual. You have been watching Newsday. I'm Kasia Madeira in London.
And I'm Sharanjit Lail in Singapore. And Kasia, someone's just told me it's your birthday. So happy birthday to you, Kasia. And to help you celebrate, we'll be revealing the world's best bars and how to mix the ultimate drink.
Oh, that's an excellent idea. Drinks on you in that case, Sharanjit. Thank you very much for the birthday wishes. Yes, it is indeed my birthday today. Thank you so much. And my lovely director even bought me some chocolates. Now, let's leave you some images of a very bumpy landing. This one comes down with a thud. This is a big Soyuz space capsule carrying 2 NASA astronauts touching down safely in Kazakhstan.